committee now welcomes the Reserve Bank of Australia and its representatives, Governor Michelle Bullock. Good morning, Ms Bullock.
Good morning.
And Assistant Governor Christopher Kent. Welcome. In welcoming the RBA, the committee recognises the central bank's independence under the Reserve Bank Act 1959, particularly in regard to monetary policy settings. The committee is cognisant that while the RBA does not receive annual appropriations, it does provide the Parliament with opportunities to discuss its insight and performance, which the committee greatly welcomes. As such, no government minister will be in attendance with the committee while representatives of the RBA are present. Good morning again, Governor. Did you wish to make any opening remarks, or are you happy to proceed?
No, I'm happy to proceed. Thank you.
We'll go straight to questions then. Thank you again for being with us, and I'll go to Senator Hume.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Bullock and Dr Kent. I want to ask, obviously in the context of national accounts figures coming out later this morning, whether the RBA expects GDP per capita to increase in today's national accounts.
Well, forecasting is a difficult process, but our expectation at this point would be no, we don't expect it to increase. We expect the growth to be quite low.
Growth to be low. And
that would imply per capita GDP to be declining as it has done.
So if it is declining, that would be how many quarters in a row of either no or negative GDP per capita growth?
I'm not sure. It would be at least the second. It might be the third. I wouldn't be 100% sure. I'd have to.
From my calculation, it's at least a full year. Is there another advanced economy, and you know, when I say advanced economy, that leaves it open to interpretation, so let's say G7, that has experienced such a protracted collapse in GDP per capita since the pandemic?
Quite a few. I couldn't say whether or not they've all had 12 months' worth, but certainly other countries have experienced declines in GDP per capita, particularly countries that have had large immigration like we've had.
What's the definition of a GDP per capita recession? 2 quarters in a row?
There is no definition of a GDP per capita recession. The concept you're referring to about a recession is something that was developed in the United States. They call it a technical recession, and it is decline of GDP 2 quarters in a row. It was, as I say, it was developed in the United States. It's a technical definition. I personally don't really think it's very helpful because recessions are about losses of jobs and human difficulties, and I don't think that sort of concept of technical recession really captures that.
So the phrase that seems to be being used is household recession. Surely that exactly encapsulates what you've just spoken about.
Household consumption is very, very weak. We know that. We know that from previous national accounts, and we know it from retail sales. I just think that the word per capita recession just gets bandied around in a way that isn't very helpful.
Yes, I remember Dr Chalmers using it an awful lot when in opposition. May I ask, yesterday an article came out in one of the major newspapers with a quote from Brendan Ryan, who's one of the economists at KPMG, who said we are a heartbeat away from recession in Australia. Is that your sense of where we are?
Our sense at the moment is that the economy is weak, yes, and it's certainly showing up in consumption, and we expect, as I said, that the national accounts that come out today will confirm that for the March quarter.
So a heartbeat away from recession is an accurate description?
I wouldn't put it quite like that. I would say that we are in a position where the economy is very weak, as I said. We've got consumption, people cutting back on discretionary expenditure, but we've still got the labour market growing. And that's a very important point to remember, that the unemployment rate is rising gradually, but employment is still growing.
So what then is driving the GDP per capita recession, or if we're not using that phrase, this very weak economy that is, as Mr Ryan said, a heartbeat away from recession? What is driving that in the RBA's view?
There's a number of things that are driving it. Higher interest rates obviously is part of that. We had to increase interest rates because inflation had risen and demand was very strong. There's a difference between thinking about growth in demand and the level of demand. So if you think about where we were maybe a year or two ago, the level of demand was much higher than the ability of the economy to supply what was being demanded. That's what's driving inflation. So growth in the economy in demand had to slow in order to bring it back more in line with supply, and that's what we're observing. So when you're thinking about the growth in demand, yes, it's had to slow because the level is still too high relative to the ability of the economy to supply.
And that growth in demand has come back. Is this the soft landing that you have been referring to, finding that sweet spot between raising interest rates and dampening demand?
Yes, it is. So what the sweet spot we're looking for is where we bring demand back into line with supply, but we don't end up in a situation where we go too far and end up in excess capacity. So that would be a situation where unemployment rises quite strongly and there's more people out of work, obviously. So the soft landing we're looking for is that demand comes back into line with supply, growth slows enough to deliver that, and we end up with employment still growing, maintaining a lot of the gains in employment we've had, and inflation coming back to target gradually.
So many economists and commentators, and actually I think maybe even you have too, have described this as a narrow path. Do you believe that Australia is still on track given the re-acceleration of core inflation since December and the continuing weak outlook in the budget papers, the productivity levels still being well below where they were in 2017? Are we still on that narrow path?
The board judges that, yes, we still are on that narrow path, that we have an opportunity here. But having said that, there are a lot of uncertainties, and I think we've made that very clear as well, that there are uncertainties on the downside. You've just highlighted a number of them. There's also uncertainties on the upside, which is that underlying inflation is coming down, but it's coming down only slowly. And this isn't just a phenomenon in Australia, it's a phenomenon overseas as well. So
that core inflation isn't coming down as fast?
It's coming down, but it's coming down slowly. Now, part of our narrow path was that we were looking not to bring it down much more quickly. Hence, we've had this strategy, if you like. The board's had a strategy of keeping policy restrictive. We think it's restrictive enough to bring demand back down to meet supply, slowly bring inflation back down, and we're forecasting that inflation will come back into target at the end of 25 and back to the midpoint of the target by 26, but there's a lot of uncertainties around that on both sides.
So what's the difference between what you're describing and stagflation? We've got 4, potentially 5 quarters of GDP per capita falling, not growing. We've got negative GDP per capita growth on average for now 8 quarters. Annual trimmed mean inflation running above 4% for 8 quarters. Labour productivity averaging negative 0.8% over 8 quarters. That sounds pretty stagflationary in the traditional definition.
The thing that's missing there is that the labour market is strong, and that's not stagflation typically you'd think of as a situation where you've got very high inflation. Inflation's high, but it's come down from 8%, 7.8%. So yes, it's higher than we're targeting at the moment, but we're still getting growth in employment, and as I said, we've got weak growth, but we judge that demand is still a bit above the ability of the capacity of the economy to supply that. So that, for me, doesn't describe stagflation.
So we go through the narrow path, and there are plenty of risks along the way. What's Plan B? So
Plan B, there's a Plan A, and the Plan A is to keep data-driven if we think we're on the narrow path, we can stay basically pretty much where we are, not ruling anything in, ruling anything out. But if it turns out, for example, that inflation starts to go up again, or it's much stickier than we think, we're not getting it down, then we won't hesitate to move and raise interest rates again. In contrast, if it turns out that the economy is much weaker than expected and that puts more downward pressure on inflation, then we'll be looking to ease. So they're the plan Bs, if you like, but they're central to the strategy of the board.
I want to come back to this issue around productivity, and I know that you've spoken about this before, I know your predecessor spoke about this before. So what are the risks to inflation and the growth outlook if productivity doesn't return to that long-term average of 1.2% or ideally higher?
So embedded in our forecasts, we have an assumption that productivity returns to something like its average prior to the pandemic. If that doesn't occur and productivity doesn't pick up, then what it means is that there's less ability for wages to rise. So the way it's been described before is that if you have, say, inflation of 2.5%, you have productivity growth of 1%, then wages can rise by about 3.5% and there's not an inflationary pressure there. The risk is that if productivity doesn't pick up, then and wages growth doesn't slow to reflect that, then you'll get inflationary pressures. That's
and what,
the risk.
In the bank's view, are some of the great drivers of productivity?
So I believe you had Danielle Wood yesterday.
Yes.
She's great on productivity. We're interested in productivity as far as it goes for inflation. But productivity is going to be driven by government decisions. It's going to be driven by things such as investment in education, in digital. I'm only repeating here what the Productivity Commission will tell you. So I concur with the sorts of things that Danielle says. From our perspective, we have to take what's given in terms of productivity and work with that.
So can I ask, at a principles level, do industrial relations policies have an impact on labour productivity?
In principle, they could, but I have no views on that.
So is the bank aware of some research that's come from the master builders that the first tranche of industrial relations reform will cost the construction sector $15.9 billion in output?
I'm not aware of that research, Senator.
Is the bank aware of some research from EY that puts the cost of abolishing the ABCC as a cost to the economy of $47 billion in lost output?
I'm personally not across that research.
Okay. Is the bank aware of some research from E61 Institute that multi-employer bargaining will reduce competition and stifle firm growth around the small business definition in the Fair Work Act?
I am aware of the E61 research.
Yes. Do you have a view on how current workplace relations reforms are likely to impact productivity and that productivity task, given that it's essential to bring down inflation, given that it's fallen 5.5% since June 2022?
No, I don't have views on particular government policies in that respect, Senator.
So what's been the impact of not achieving the long-term average productivity growth over the last 2 years to the budget?
So I want to just caution about looking at productivity growth over the last 2 years. Productivity growth over the last 2 years has been absolutely driven by the COVID shock. It's been up, it's been down, it's been affected by shutdowns, opening up, immigration. So I would caution very much against reading too much into, or anything much, into the wiggles over the last couple of years. I think we've got to take a step back here and look at what happens to productivity in a longer run sense and all the sorts of things that the Productivity Commission talks about and government policies. That's what's relevant for that.
So, and I want to mention that because you and your predecessor too have previously supported the implementation of the Productivity Commission's 5-year Advancing Prosperity Review. So from your observation, are many of those reforms being enacted in the budget?
Again, these are government policies. I'm not telling the government what to enact, and I'm not telling them that they have to enact anything. All I'm saying is that the Productivity Commission obviously has views on this. They've got lots of good ideas, and it's up to the government to decide how they want to and if they want to implement those.
So when does the RBA anticipate that it will see a return to that 1.2% productivity growth?
We've got productivity growth returning over the next few years to around about that level.
Over the next few years? Can you be a little bit more specific?
Well, over the forecast period. So
over
the next couple of years, we're forecasting that productivity will start to rise. Again, I caution, if you look at the productivity numbers, they have been all over the place.
And is your inflation forecast dependent on that being achieved?
Yes, it is.
Governor, I just have one more question, then I'm going to turn over to colleagues. But a number of economists have publicly questioned the fiscal stance of the budget, not for the first time in recent years. This is a budget that spends $4 in new policy spending for every $1 that it raises. And that spending growth is both in real and in nominal terms. It's growing at twice the rate of economic growth. Is this budget, in your view, is its fiscal stance contractionary or expansionary over the forward estimates?
That's a very complex question to answer. It's not simple. And the reason it's not simple is it's not the only thing that is impacting whether or not we're in an expansionary or contractionary phase. The start of your questions was all about how weak the economy is. There's the international environment as well, and China. So I don't think it's helpful to think about the budget and say it's expansionary or contractionary without thinking about what else is happening in the economy. If it's true and at 11:30 we get numbers that show the economy is very, very weak, then there's offsetting forces here. So I would just say that I think we have to be careful. We are going to look at our forecasts in August, as we always do. We will take into account the fiscal and what's going on in the private sector of the economy and what's going on overseas, and we will see what that means for inflation. I would note, though, that Treasury, in their forecasts, have the new budget in there, and they still have inflation coming back down into the band in the same timeline as we do, by 2026. So I think you just need to think that it's part of the story, it's not the whole story.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Hume. I'll just follow on with a few questions along a similar line from Senator Hume about the narrow path that we're all working towards. You know, that narrow path is about getting through the inflation challenge, and I think inflation is now at about half what it was at that high point, which I think was at the end of 22. You talked a little bit about the labour market and, you know, how do we maintain those gains in employment. And you've talked about the economy and the need to move through and get to a point where we can strengthen economic growth. So lots of opportunities and lots of challenges in all of that. We have had significant jobs growth here over the last couple of years, and I think that's one of the features of the sort of post-COVID period here in Australia. I think it's significantly higher, the jobs growth, than it's been in other similar economies around the world. So how do you see the labour market performing, and how important is maintaining those employment gains to keeping on the path that we all want to be on?
So the labour market has performed very well, and it's performed we've had lots of growth in employment. The unemployment rate is rising gradually, but it's risen from a low of 3.5%. Some of the other really, really great things that we saw in the labour market were that longer-term unemployed, that fell as well, so that was good. Youth unemployment fell to its historically low levels. The participation rate is up at historical highs, particularly women and older people are participating more in the workforce. So despite high participation rates, much higher growth in the labour force itself through immigration, we still have really low unemployment. So I think that's really a testament to how well the labour market has performed. We are seeing the labour market ease, and it's easing on a number of measures. Some of the leading measures, including vacancies and advertisements and job churn, those sorts of things are suggesting the labour market is easing. We really hope that we can maintain those gains, and that as the economy slows, that the labour market... It's worth pointing out that as the unemployment rate is rising, that's because the labour force is growing a bit more quickly than people are being employed. Employment is still growing. It's just growing more slowly than it was. So that's, again, the narrow path we're hoping to maintain. We're hoping to maintain a situation where employment continues to grow, not quite as quickly because the labour market was under quite a lot of pressure. Again, it comes back to this point about supply and demand, that the demand for labour was much greater than the supply of labour. But if we can slow that demand for labour a little bit, still have employment growing, then that will be the narrow path for us.
Okay. So in terms of your, long-standing mandate for full employment, along with price stability, how are you viewing that challenge over the next year or so of balancing those things and making sure, of course, that we maintain those gains for people? Because I think if people want one thing from the economy, they want a job that they can count on, and that's incredibly important for people at all stages of their life. And we know that if people don't get out into the labour market early, they struggle later on. We know, of course, that inflation hits people without a job the hardest. So how are you thinking about balancing those mandates and working towards full employment over the next year or so?
So at the moment, the board thinks, as I said, that monetary policy is restrictive, and that is slowing the economy, and that is going to help bring things back into better balance. We are forecasting. Forecasting is a difficult process and there's lots of uncertainty around it, but our central forecast at the moment has the unemployment rate rising gradually and inflation coming back down into the band over the next couple of years. We could seek to get inflation back down more quickly, which might require higher interest rates, but we've chosen to try and bring this down onto the narrow path. Having said that, if inflation doesn't come down, then we do have an issue, and the board won't hesitate to act if it feels that inflation is not coming down, or it's not coming down quickly enough, or inflationary expectations are starting to get out of control. They're starting to rise. In those circumstances, the worst possible thing for employment over the long run is high inflation. So it's really important that we get inflation back down into the band, get it anchored back down into the band, and if it doesn't look like it's getting there, then we will have to take action.
And in terms of your forecasts, which have been published and you've just discussed about the time frame for getting back into the band, can you just, for the benefit of the committee, explain when you would kind of look at the data again and, assess those forecasts in the normal course of events as you would?
So the normal course for us is that we have a forecasting round every 3 months: February, May, August, November. So our next forecasting round, if you like, will be in August, and we'll release those forecasts at the conclusion of the Reserve Bank Board meeting in August. And so we will be gearing up, and the things that will be taken into account is any data that's come in since then, both overseas and in Australia, both on inflation and activity, and those are the sorts of things that will go into that. So the last set of forecasts, as I said, are as at May. There's a bit of water under the bridge since then, so we'll come back to that in August and relook at those forecasts.
Okay, thank you. Senator...
Canavan.
Sorry, where?
Canavan.
Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Bullock. I just wanted to go to the RBA's calculation or forecasting of underlying inflation measures. Do you calculate, or forecast, I suppose is the proper word, the ABS core inflation measures, the trim mean and the weighted mean?
We do, yes. We have forecasts for the trim mean explicitly set out in our forecasts.
Okay. And what were for both of those, the trim mean and the weighted mean, what were those for the 24-25 year in the Statement on Monetary Policy forecast?
In the May Statement on Monetary Policy, we had trim mean inflation in December 25 at 2.8%, so that's the end of next year.
2.8 for December 25. What about for... These are year-ending too, aren't they? There, so
yes, that's right.
Full, that's the calendar year 25.
Yep.
What about for the financial year? Do you have that for June 25?
The June 25, 3.1.
Right, that's trim mean, and
yes.
You've got weighted mean as well?
No, we only forecast trim
you only forecast trim mean? Okay. So how do you... These forecasts, are they a building block sort of approach? Do you do forecasts for kind of each of the different 87 lines of expenditure in the basket?
No, we have models. We have a number of models which forecast inflation.
Right.
We can look at particular special cases. So sometimes we look at what we know is happening. We make assumptions, for example, about petrol prices, which are basically that they don't move, or whatever they are. And we use the models to basically make sure that the forecasts are internally consistent, but we also apply judgment to that. Okay. So we look at what else is going on in the economy, what we've seen in the past, have the models underperformed or overperformed, do we need to adjust? So
you say you make some exceptions there. Do you, or have you, for these latest figures we just went through, have you prepared forecasts for electricity price growth?
I don't know if we've got explicit forecasts for electricity price growth. What we would have is what we know is in the default market offers and those sorts of things, but we wouldn't have a model that forecasts electricity price growth. We would take what we know from various data points, in particular. So
you wouldn't be able to say, or maybe you could take on notice, whether you've forecast for the 24-25 year electricity price growth that's sort of above average or below average, or...
I think we would probably take the default market offer and put that in, is my feeling, but I can certainly take it on notice explicitly.
Okay. But the overarching approach would be to start with a macroeconomic model which isn't looking at those disaggregates.
Right.
But we'd also use judgment based on some of those key categories to sort of cross-check.
Because then I'm wondering, I mean, how is your trim mean forecast different then from your headline inflation forecasts? If you're just using a macroeconomic model, how do you determine which bits of the 87 expenditure items are going to be outside the 70% trim?
Well, we'd start in the near term with some of those obvious outliers in the sort of most recent quarter, and then we'd assume something about petrol prices and know how long it might take for those items to become, for headline inflation to sort of come towards trim. But trim further out is kind of the core of the forecast, and then headline will move towards that within a reasonable period of time. Yeah. And that's the assumption.
Right, okay. And so, I mean, if you use the default market offers, there was some slight reductions this year, or this forthcoming year, financial year. It's probably fair to say your electricity price forecast would have not been outside the 70% trim. For the May statement. You're not going to speculate, but it sounds like that would be the case. I mean, obviously, since the Statement of Monetary Policy has been the government's rebates announced, so will you now, for the future forecasts you do, look at that as a special case that might fall outside the median.
So that would be something that we would expect to be reflected in headline inflation, and I think
that's right. Yep.
Treasury's estimates of about half a percentage point. We think that's probably about right. So that would be reflected in headline inflation, but underlying inflation, trim mean, we wouldn't expect it to be reflected in that.
You wouldn't expect it to be because it will be such a large change. Yeah, it'll fall outside that band. And what about, there's also state-based rebates as well. Yes. You'll be considering those as well, yes, presumably. That will
take those into account.
That would only just further exacerbate this issue that will be outside that basis. So, I mean, then I suppose that raises the question then, how much influence then it will have on monetary policy settings if the government's rebates don't affect the underlying inflation, the trim mean forecasts. Would the RBA sort of abstract then from these one-off large changes to individual lines of expenditure?
Yes, we do. We have, and we've done in the past. We try to look through things that are one-off and are going to be reversed. We tend to look through those things.
Right. So the summary of that then is that the government's rebates the electricity price rebates haven't materially changed the risk of an interest rate rise over the next year.
The government's rebates, yes, will affect headline inflation, and at the margin they might affect, to the extent that inflation might have a 2 on it in a headline sense, it might affect people's sort of expectations, and it will also might affect prices that are indexed. But in terms of the underlying pulse of inflation, we're looking through that to the underlying, the trim mean, if you like, and we don't think it's going to have an impact on that.
Okay. I was actually going to ask, I mean, it's very, you basically confer for me, but I just looked back at RBA statements when the GST was introduced, and it was very clear that the RBA made it clear that they wouldn't make a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that inflation was going to be above target at the time the GST was introduced. And this is not dissimilar then, is it? This is a subsidy rather than a tax, but it's a sort of artificial change in measured inflation that doesn't affect underlying inflation pressures.
We're looking through those sorts of things that are impacting headline and will be reversed. They'll come off again in a year's time, and we're looking at the underlying pulse.
Yeah. I mean, there is, I suppose, one difference here compared to the GST. When the GST was introduced, while there was an increase in prices for people, there were also income tax cuts, which largely made whole, if not gave people more money in their pocket. And so there was somewhat of a neutralisation of any second-round effects, if you like, on people's spending, disposable income. In this situation, though, there's not that. The government is effectively, over the next few years, going into debt to fund the rebates. There's not a corresponding increase in taxes or some such. So what about the second-round effects here of these rebates, including the state ones, which are not small? Are you at all concerned then about the impact of those having second-round impacts on higher inflationary pressures?
No, I'm not really. I think the quantums are small enough that I don't think they really are going to have much of a second-round impact on demand and inflation. If you think about the $300, $75 a quarter off your electricity bill, are people going to go out and spend up big on that? I really don't think so. It is different than giving someone $300 and saying, here's $300. So I think at the margin it's not really going to have much impact in a second round sense.
How is it different than that? It is basically giving someone $300, isn't it? I mean, there's a bit of a quibble from mine here, but I mean, how is it different for me?
So it's
because now I have $300 that I would have had to spend otherwise. So
over a year,
unless people are paying less than $300 on their power bill, I suppose.
It's psychologically, I think it's different.
Okay.
Because if you hand someone $300 and say, here's $300,
right.
I think psychologically they think of that differently than if they see that they're
Yeah, the helicopter
bill
is
is
different.
just,
The helicopter of cash is different, you think?
the helicopter of cash that was, you know, we saw it utilised in the pandemic, and people went out and spent it. So, having
but I
said
suppose
that,
the implication of what you're saying is the $300 rebate is not materially changing people's cost of living. It's not making material impact. It's
not that, I would say it's not that material.
Yeah.
It is helping people who clearly are hurting at the moment. But I don't think it's material in terms of our forecast for inflation. And if you look at the error bands around the inflation forecast, I think that's even more pertinent.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And I am going to Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, Chair. And good morning, Ms Bullock and Dr Kent. Thank you for your participation. The evidence from the Secretary of the Treasury, Dr Kennedy, aligns with your comments earlier this morning in regards to expectations from the national accounts today that reveal, the expectation is that they will reveal weak growth. And of course, if the consensus of commentators is realised, this could be the weakest or the slowest growth for over 3 decades, excluding the pandemic periods. I notice that you're nodding in agreement. Ms Bullock?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Is the narrow path narrowing?
It was pretty narrow to begin with, I'd say.
It was pretty narrow to begin with.
It was pretty narrow to begin with.
I'd agree with that. Mm-hmm.
But so far, as I said, we seem to be still on it. We still have employment growing. We have inflation coming down. As I said, it was a conscious decision to bring inflation back to target, but do it in a measured way so we could preserve the gains to employment. So at the moment, we're still on it.
I suppose my question, just staying on this point, is the upside and downside risks in balance at the moment?
I think we'd characterise, the board would characterise the risks as being there are risks on the upside and the downside. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, and that's, I've used the word, I can't rule anything in or out, reflecting that fact. Mm-hmm. That, though, to a point, even though the risks are balanced, the cost of higher inflation is something that we've got in mind. So if it did seem that the risks shift to the upside, then we're very conscious that the costs of that are much higher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the risks might be in balance, but the consequences not. Thank you very much. The Treasury, in Budget Paper 2, has calculated the non-accelerating inflation of unemployment at 4.5%. Mm-hmm. Do you have a calculation in regards to the Nauru?
I think ours is currently about 4.3-ish, so it's lower than it used to be, mm-hmm. but it's around about about 4.3.
Mm-hmm. With a huge range of uncertainty.
With a whole range of uncertainty around it, if you look at the models.
Yes. What have been the key drivers of core inflation since the beginning of this year?
The key driver of core inflation has been excessive demand over supply. We talked mm-hmm. earlier about that. The inflation initially, as you probably know, was driven by strong demand at the time of massive supply chain issues. So there was a big component of temporary inflation, which, as Senator said earlier, peaked at 7.8% in 2020, end of 2022. It's come down a long way since then as those issues have unwound. The current issue is that non-tradables inflation, which reflects domestic demand pressures, is more elevated. It's sitting at around about 4%. Mm-hmm. It's coming down slowly, and that is reflective, as I said, of demand being higher than supply.
Can you be more specific in regards to what those core drivers, what those key drivers are of core inflation? So,
if you think about people demanding services in the economy, just say services, at the same time as you've got people demanding services. You've got a lot of costs for businesses going up, so things like insurance, administration, wages, these sorts of things, all these labour and non-labour costs are going up to businesses. Businesses can pass those on if there is strong demand for their services. So if you think about some of the things that are being demanded, you know, coming out of the pandemic, there were lots of things that people couldn't do when they were in lockdown that they just desperately wanted to do when they weren't anymore. So restaurants,
travel,
travel, all of the sorts of nice things we get, our nails done and our hair and all those sorts of things. People wanted to do those sorts of things. So there was a strong demand for that. So there was a sense in which the vestiges of the pandemic were adding to demand at a time when there was supply issues. And the supply issue that was most at the front of minds then was, in fact, labour. People couldn't get people to work. And so those two things meeting meant that input costs went up. There was strong demand, so they could pass that on in their prices. So that's the sort of thing I mean by demand being more than supply.
So how is Australia's experience in regards to core inflation since the beginning of this year different or the same to that which has been observed in the United States or Canada or the European area?
It's very similar experience. So what you've observed overseas is that, just as happened here, the initial supply chain issues resolved. A lot of there were special factors in various places. Europe, for example, was particularly impacted by energy costs. Their inflation went up over 10% and energy was a big part of that. As some of these supply shocks have fallen out, inflation overseas has come down. But if you look at core inflation, and services inflation in particular overseas, the experience there is very similar to here. And that's something that I think is of interest because there's obviously something that's similar across countries which is driving that, and its demand versus supply is often part of that.
Just turning to the matter of real disposable income. Let's start with real wages. What's the bank's expectation in regards to real wages over the year to December?
Okay.
The year to December 2024.
Real household disposable income I've got, as we forecast, but not real wages. But
So just to be clear, my first question is, what's the latest forecasts? So what is the bank's latest forecast in regards to real wages over the year to December 2024?
Small growth, right?
Yeah, very small growth.
Very small growth.
Yep. So we've got wage price index at about 3.8, and we've got inflation at 3.8. So zero on wage price index basis
for this calendar year.
For this calendar year.
How far have Australians? How far have the living standards of Australians fallen? Can the bank do that?
Real wages have fallen by around about. I don't know specific. I can't give. I'd have to give you a specific number. Take a specific number away, but. Over the past year or so, couple of years, real wages have fallen because inflation has been much higher than wage rises.
Is the bank able to provide us information over the last 2 years in terms of the real disposable income per capita?
We can take that on notice and provide that, yeah.
When does the bank expect Australian households to return to the living standards that they were experiencing pre-pandemic?
We expect real wages to start to rise basically from now. We think they are rising now, so as inflation is coming down. So when that gets us back to, I think it's about mid-26, I think that we'll have real wages back to where they were prior to the pandemic.
But
can I check that on notice, please?
Yes, please, yep. You've characterised the inflation tackle as bumpy, my word, not yours, but it is up and down.
I think I've used the word too.
Okay, we're agreed on the word bumpy. So then the real disposable income experience, or when Australians can expect to get back to their pre-pandemic experience, will also be bumpy and unreliable and uncertain?
Well, yes, these are all forecasts. And forecasts are, as I keep saying, inherently uncertain, and particularly as you go out a year or so, they get very uncertain. So we have a central forecast. There's big bounds around it, so yes.
Governor, you've said that the board will not hesitate to lift interest rates if the inflation challenge is not tackled. You will raise interest rates if necessary during a campaign period, an election campaign period?
I'm not speculating on any campaign periods, but the board will do what they think they need to do on inflation.
When it needs, to be done.
The board will be driven by the data, and the data will tell us if we need to move.
Thank you. I just want to turn to the timing of the budget and RBA forecasts, if I have a few moments remaining.
I think your colleagues will grant you that as well, Senator Smith.
Great, thank you very much. Were you, in previous evidence, I think you have shared that you were asked to peer review the government Stage 3 tax cut initiative. Were you asked to peer review any elements of the 2024-2025 budget?
I might just correct there. We were never asked to peer review the Stage 3 tax cuts. I think what I said at the time was that Treasury ran their analysis past us to tell us what was happening. We weren't asked to peer review it. Similarly, we were not asked to peer review anything to do with the budget.
And no elements of the budget were passed by the RBA for their consideration or comment?
I had discussions with the Treasury Secretary. I also speak regularly to the Treasurer, and the Treasurer spoke to me about some elements of the budget, but I was not asked to peer review the budget.
So just staying with the conversation with the Treasurer, was that on the eve of the budget? Was that as part of the final stages of budget preparation? Was that in the month preceding the budget's official release? Can you give the committee a sense of timing?
Yeah, sure. So, no, it wasn't the eve of the budget. I mean, as I said, I speak to the Treasurer on a regular basis, and among other things, he mentioned some things to do with the budget in the months leading up to the budget, some potential issues.
Are you able to disclose to the committee what those potential issues
were?
Well,
they're private discussions between the Treasurer and I. Suffice to say that I wasn't asked to peer review the budget, but he did mention some of the things that they were considering in the budget.
Were they expenditure measures or revenue measures?
They were mainly to do with expenditure measures, but I'm not. I'd rather not. It was a private conversations. I'd rather respect that if I could. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Kennedy, how does Dr. Kennedy, as a member of the board, share with the board and yourself issues around budget consideration, how budget decisions should get incorporated into the RBA's forecasting, general discussions around budget parameters? Does the Secretary of the Treasury bring that forward to the board in a written form? Is it part of the board conversation in a more informal way? Does it exist as an agenda item in the board's deliberations? How does the Secretary of the Treasury bring forward budget considerations or budget discussions, but in the first point, and then secondly, broader issues that might be relevant?
There's nothing formal about it. There's no formal agenda item. The way the board works is a general discussion about, led by presentations on the economy. If there is a point at which it is relevant to bring in issues to do with government fiscal issues, then the Secretary of the Treasury brings those in at that point. It's quite an organic process rather than a sort of a formal written paper or an agenda item.
When the Treasurer, and I totally accept that the Treasurer may have cause to ring and share views with the Governor of the RBA, is the nature of the conversation, is the nature of the informal discussions to seek your endorsement, or is it to provide information?
The conversations I have with the Treasurer are about providing information and making sure that we don't surprise one another. So I tell him things that I don't want him to find out in the media, for example. I'd rather he find out from me. And likewise, he will talk to me about things that he wants me to know. And that's the nature of the exchange of information.
Thank you.
Deputy Chair.
Thanks very much. Governor, you have previously said that if inflation doesn't come down, it will be a problem. Inflation has been up in the last few monthly figures. So when does that become a significant problem?
So the challenge is that, yes, you're right, it's blipped up a little bit in the last couple of monthly figures. The trouble with the monthly figures is that they're not comprehensive. They tend to focus, so the first one of the quarter, the first month of the quarter tends to be more goods weighted, the second one tends to be more services weighted. So really what we are looking for is the comprehensive quarterly CPI. Now the challenge for us there is that we only get 4 of them a year, obviously, and it's therefore quite difficult to read momentum into quarterly figures because you only get one, obviously, every 3 months. So I think what we would say about the monthly figures is that it's coming down less quickly than we thought it would. It's coming down more slowly than we thought it would. But we really need to wait and get a comprehensive read to see if that confirms what we're seeing in the monthly figures. It's you don't have to go back long, maybe a few months, when the monthly figures were all surprising on the downside, and everyone was saying, "Oh, interest rates, inflation's falling much more quickly. Interest rates are going to come down really quickly." Now they've surprised a little bit on the upside. Everyone's saying, "Oh, interest rates are going to have to go up." It's surprising on the upside. I think we just need to step back a little bit and just watch what's happening in a longer-term sense.
So how important are the June quarterly figures for monetary policy?
They are important because we are trying to make sure that we bring inflation back down to target in the next couple of years. We plan to bring it back by the end of 25, back in the target range as our forecasts have. So it is important. It's not the single most important thing because it is a lagging indicator, and there are other things that we will be considering as well, and that, for example, some of the information we'll get out of the national accounts, which will tell us where the economy is sitting. So because of the lags in these things, we've got to make judgments about whether or not the inflation numbers we're seeing are in fact reflecting conditions that were 6 months ago, or are they in fact now quite current? And what are the other factors, for example, the employment market? What are the other factors that are telling us that price pressures might be easing going further out? So yes, they're important, but they're not the single thing to be looked at.
Okay. Well, I imagine you're doing your best there. Now, can I ask you about some of the comments made by the Deputy Governor recently in the AFR? Mr Hauser said that we have a dual mandate in reference to the Reserve Bank, and he said that that was clarified and strengthened in the statement of the conduct of monetary policy last December. Governor, you have previously said that the statement of conduct of monetary policy was not a substantive change to the status quo. So is that still your view?
Yes, it's not a substantive change to the way we were really operating anyway. The point about the statement on the conduct of monetary policy is that that document clarified things, but my view was I don't know if you had a view, Chris, but my view was that the way we were operating is in fact reflected in that statement.
Yeah, we've long recognised the dual mandate.
Okay. Mr Hauser also said that in the financial review he talked about some energy policy factors, and I was just wondering whether energy policy and emissions policy is something that you see sitting within monetary policy or fiscal policy.
No, electricity policy is very much firmly the role of the government. It's relevant for us to understand it because we need to understand the potential implications for monetary policy and inflation, but energy policy is not the Reserve Bank's.
So it's not something for the RBA to be doing, is it?
It's not the Reserve Bank's responsibility, but we do need to understand it, is what I'm saying.
You need to understand, but it's not your role to be running that policy.
We don't run that policy.
No, I didn't think so. And then finally, Mr Hauser also talked about, well, there were references to this in this article about climate change, labour markets, the role of superannuation and supply chains, and I think he used the expression pushing the envelope. So again, are these matters that fit within your day-to-day responsibilities?
No, they're not, and I'll have to go back and reread the article, but it's not my impression that the Deputy Governor was saying they are our responsibilities. So
okay.
I think maybe there might be a bit of misinterpretation there.
I think he was intending to convey the sense that central banks globally have always been quite focused on modelling and understanding and forecasting demand-side factors, but we had to get better at understanding, modelling and forecasting supply-side factors.
No, I figured that was the case. Just wanted to get that on the record. Look, just finally, Chair, I just have one last question about something unrelated, which is to do with there were some claims made on the project on Channel 10 that the RBA had said that people who withdrew super during COVID had lost a lot of money as a result of them using their own money. So that was news to me that the Reserve Bank had commissioned that research. Is that right?
No, we did not commission any such research. So the Reserve Bank periodically runs conferences and workshops at which we get together academics, other people who have an interest in economics to present papers. My understanding is that there was a paper at a workshop that we organised and ran which made those claims. The Reserve Bank did not commission the research and it's not the Reserve Bank's research.
Thank you very much.
Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chair. And good morning to you, Ms Bullock and Dr Kent. I'm from the state of New South Wales, and I'm so proud to be a New South Welsh woman, you know, especially when I see the shining parts of Sydney. But recently I've been out in Western New South Wales, communities like Brewarrina and Broken Hill, right across the country, wherever you live. The impact of the work of the RBA, I know that you're acting in the national interest, but it has material effect on people's real life. So my questions go to not just the modelling, about which we've had some questions, and I'm comforted that there's going to be very good information that will inform the decision-making in the interest of the nation. But my questions really go to the impact of how the interest rate rises are being felt throughout the economy. And I'm trying to test in my question really, what is your awareness about the impact of that at this point of time? Is that one of the factors that you are really taking into account?
So the first point to make is that rising interest rates, monetary policy does affect different parts of the community differently. We know this. Obviously, people who have debts, they face higher interest rates, it hurts them. People that actually have assets, savings, for example, they benefit from higher interest income. So it does impact people differently, we know that. But we do have to, in setting monetary policy, we have to take into account the aggregate effect and what that aggregate effect is on inflation. So we try to impact aggregate demand, We can't impact supply. Now, in impacting aggregate demand, obviously, there are various channels through which monetary policy works. One that people focus on most is the cash flow channel, but that's not the only channel. But the cash flow channel is important in Australia because we have a lot of people with variable rate debt, variable rate mortgages in particular, and they get immediately impacted as interest rates rise. This is quite different than some countries overseas. So there's quite an immediate and obvious impact on those people. How do we monitor what's going on with those people? There's a number of ways. The first is that I can tell you I get lots and lots of letters, and I read those letters, and some of them are very hard to read. People are experiencing challenging times. Having said that, we can't set interest rates with respect to one group of people. We have to think of the economy as a whole. So when I talked earlier about the narrow path, one of the things that's really important for people who have debts and are trying to meet their repayments is that they have a job.
Absolutely.
So for us, this is why this concept of the narrow path and not doing more than we absolutely have to do is so important. So that's what we've sort of got in mind. As I said, we have to set interest rates at the aggregate, but we are conscious of what's going on with some people, and we do hear those stories, and that's really what's driving us to try and make sure that we keep on this narrow path.
So earlier when you spoke about the multitude of factors that the board takes into account, you used a very important word, in my view, which is judgment. And I have no doubt that those people who have written to you are asking you, and the people who are writing to us in the communities that we live and work in are telling us is that they are feeling incredible pressure right now. Yeah. And while I'm sure that they will be proud of your taking your role so seriously, the focus on the narrow path is also an opportunity for the potential for some relief for those people whose mortgages in the cash flow channel are being impacted. And I guess I'm seeking reassurance on behalf of all of those in the cash flow channel, millions of Australians, that should the opportunity present itself, that the judgment of the Reserve Bank to reduce interest rates will happen at the earliest opportunity.
Yes, the Reserve Bank board is focused on... That's part of the... So let me just take a step back for a minute. There's two things going on, I think, with people who are finding it hard at the moment. It's not just mortgagees. Inflation is actually the thing that is hurting absolutely everyone. So we talk about the cash flow channel and the people who have mortgages hurting, but that's about a third to 40% of the population. The rest of the population are also hurting, and everyone is hurting because of inflation. So yes, I can say that if it looks like inflation is coming back down, the board will be looking to lower interest rates at an appropriate point in time. If it looks like we're going to meet our target, then we will remove the restrictive nature of monetary policy. That's what we will do. But what I want to emphasise to people is that the precondition for that is that inflation needs to be coming back down and be sustainably back in the band on the board's timetable, because if it's not, we can't remove the restrictiveness of monetary policy. It won't be good for people now because inflation will be hurting everyone. It won't be good for those people on mortgages because inflation will still be high. And it won't be good, ultimately, for employment, because it will mean that we'll have to act harder in the future in order to get inflation back down. So that is the real message that I want to get across.
I think that message has come through, and there will be people who really understand that. But my request is that is it the board's thinking that the relief that is so sought by so many will be provided at the earliest opportunity?
It'll be provided when the board is convinced that inflation is coming back down to within target. That's when the relief from interest rates will come. I can't forecast when that will be.
No, I'm not asking for a date, but I guess clarification. Will the burden that is being borne be part of the judgment factor that you will bring to the decision? Are you hearing the Australian people?
We're hearing from those people, and we don't want to prolong higher interest rates for longer than we have to, but we need to make sure that they're in place for long enough to bring inflation back down.
Thank you. And I'm sure there's some comfort there for people that we'll get there, and sooner the better. Clearly, in the cash flow channel, households have had to respond to the reality of rising interest rates. So my question is, in terms of what the RBA knows, how have households responded to rising interest rates in terms, in particular, of discretionary spending and also non-discretionary spending?
So I might make a couple of remarks and I'll pass to Chris because I think he has a few perspectives on this as well. So what we know is that people are responding by cutting back discretionary spending. They are shifting to more value.
What does that actually mean, Ms Bullock?
Well, discretionary spending means different things to different people. But, for example, it might mean that I don't get my nails done every month, now I get them done every 2 months, say. It might mean that instead of going out to breakfast on Saturday morning and dinner on Friday night, I only go out to dinner on Friday night. That's what I mean. Now, different discretionary spending means different things to different people. Some people might say school fees are discretionary. Others would say they are absolutely not discretionary. So I don't want to sort of say these things are all discretionary and these things aren't.
So people make judgments based on their income and their debt. Yep.
And they can make judgments. Now, there's certain things that you would think are non-discretionary. Things that you might put in that bucket would be electricity, rent, housing repayments, food, obviously, putting food on the table. So what we know is that people tend to be cutting back on what you might loosely call discretionary items, although there's some rubberiness about what that might mean. And in the essential category, people are, where they can, buying cheaper. So they might be buying the home brand rather than the named brand to try and make ends meet a little better. So that's what we sort of know about their spending. The other thing we know about their spending, and we get a lot of information from the banks on their customers, what their customers are spending money on, and the various cohorts of their customers. And what we know from that also is that everyone is cutting back. So growth in spending for mortgagees and non-mortgagees is much lower than it was. And that's not surprising, really, because non-mortgagees are often renters. So they're cutting back. We know that all age groups, spending is growing slower than it was. It's growing slower for some particularly younger people than it is for older people, but everyone has slowed their spending. So we know some of those things about spending. We also know a little bit about saving, but I want to pass to Chris to talk a little bit about what else we know about. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things the Governor was saying is that in some ways surprising to people how spending is weak across the board, different ages, whether they own a house, whether they have a mortgage on a house, whether they're renters. And I think one of the features there is higher interest rates don't just work through the cash flow channel, but they also provide a big incentive for everyone to save more. And that is what's happening more or less. The saving rate has dropped from the very high levels during the pandemic when people couldn't go out and spend, but they haven't dropped so low that people are running down those extra stock of savings to any large degree for households as a whole. There are some households who really have eat into whatever savings they put away during the pandemic, but the household sector as a whole has not done that. The other thing is that's quite interesting and surprising to people is households which have a mortgage as a whole are putting in about the average amount of extra payments over and above what the banks require them to make every time they make their mortgage repayments. So I think that's this incentive that comes from having higher interest rates. There's an incentive for everybody to save more, and I think that explains some of the behaviour the Governor was outlining.
So that's a very important piece of evidence, I think, this morning, because, you know, one thing that I'm proud of as an Australian is how we all stick together, you know, and it's not like there's one part of the economy or one part of the population that's really just completely copying it. Everybody is feeling this. We're all doing this together is what I take from what you said there.
Look, and it's worth, I mean, Chris mentioned this, I mean, there is absolutely a portion of the population that are really hurting. They're hurting from inflation, they're hurting from higher interest rates, or they're hurting from higher rents. We get that, we do. But on the whole, people are responding, and they're responding by cutting back where they can, and we're seeing this in the consumption numbers.
And that is helping you in your task.
That's helping with that task. And as Chris said, this is part of the transmission of monetary policy. It's, yes, the cash flow channel. It's the incentive to save rather than to spend when interest rates go up. People with mortgages, to the point, they are putting extra savings into their extra amounts of money into their offset and redraw accounts effectively. They've got a great incentive to do that, because if they're paying now 6.5%, 7% on their mortgage, there's a great incentive to try and offset as much of that as you possibly can. Get your net debt down as low as you can. So they're responding in the way that you think they would, and they're doing that by reducing their consumption, which is helping the aggregate demand story. But again, I come back to a really critical point here, which is that employment is really important here as well, because while people have jobs, they've got these options. They've got the option, they've got money coming in, they've just got to try and figure out how to rearrange their finances a bit, rearrange their spending in order to meet. If they don't have a job, it gets much harder. So
we're on the narrow path, and Australians are doing their bit to keep us there. So we should be congratulated, I think, as a group together. Can I just raise with you concern, though, that I think people might have with regard to the lag in the monetary policy that you've been referring to, and the action that you've taken. How much of the 425 basis points rise in interest rates do you think have already flowed through to have an impact? Because, you know, we hear that it can be quite immediate in its impact in some ways, but then there's a delay in it finally working its way through. Where are we in terms of that flow through of the impact of the interest rate rises that Australians have seen?
So there's a general point there and a mechanical point. I'll ask Chris to address the mechanical point. The general point is that when we talk about monetary policy and the flow-through, we generally think about the flow-through of monetary policy to take 12 to 18 months in full. So a large chunk of that 425 was just to remove the very accommodative stance of monetary policy. We think we're now restrictive. I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't really give you a number of how restrictive we are, but we think we are restrictive. The signs are that it's working, so that suggests we're restrictive. But it's possible that there's still, in the general sense, maybe if we think, say, 12 months, there's maybe another 50 basis points or so maybe to come through, but maybe not, because the standard term here is that they're long and variable lags, and we don't know. So, but there is a mechanical point that I want Chris to sort of speak to, because I think it partly goes to answer your question as well.
So in terms of mortgage rates that the average mortgage holder is paying, something like about 80% of those 425 basis point increases in the cash rate have been passed through to the average outstanding mortgage rate. And that reflects a couple of things. Obviously, a lot more and a lot more quickly for people on variable rate mortgages has been passed through. This time round, the pass-through has been a bit slower than normal because we started raising rates at a point when there was a very much higher share of fixed-rate mortgages than the economy normally would see. Normally it might sit around at about 20% of mortgages are fixed. We came into this with something much closer to sort of 40%, that order of magnitude. But most of those very low fixed-rate loans have now rolled off. People have been able to manage those changes, more or less. The fixed rate mortgagee rolling off doesn't now look much different from the variable rate mortgagee in terms of their ability to meet their payments. A little bit more is still to come through. There's still a few people with very low fixed rate mortgages that are rolling off. Most of that will finish this year, and that may add another 20 basis points or so to the average outstanding mortgage rate. The other thing that's happened just very quickly is banks have actually been competing a bit more vigorously for good quality borrowers, and so those who are able to either change banks or negotiate with their banks have been getting better deals than they might otherwise have got, and that's helped mean that that's why only about 80% of the increase in the cash rates passed through.
Thank you. I'm heartened that you'll really respond to those letter writers, and that you're hearing us as parliamentarians letting you know that constituents are waiting for that narrow path to be walked and for a reduction to come to them as soon as possible. Thank you.
Senator McKim.
Good morning. Thanks for coming in. I wanted to ask some questions around the distributional impact of your decisions on interest rates, and you've touched a little bit, Ms Bullock, on that already this morning. Can I just be clear? Is it your evidence that all age cohorts are reducing their spending at the moment? Because that's contrary to some reports that have been released publicly.
Not reducing, slowing the growth rate in their spending.
Oh.
And the numbers that we see, they're typically from the banks, and they're nominal, so it doesn't take into account inflation. So, but the general position is that everyone has slowed the growth rate in their spending.
Oh, okay. So your evidence is that the growth rate is slowing across cohorts. But we are seeing evidence where younger folk, who generally carry more debt than older folk, are cutting back their spending significantly in some age cohorts by over 7% reduction on spending on essentials, where folks over 65 who are more likely, as you've indicated, to have savings and lower or no debt, they've got access to sort of tax breaks in their super, they're actually increasing their spending above the rate of inflation. Is that, would you accept that?
No, well, there's a variety of pieces of evidence here. I understand that there is a younger cohort that in real terms is cutting back their expenditure, but the fact remains, as I said earlier, that everyone is slowing their expenditure. They might still be spending, but they're not spending. The growth rate in their expenditure is not as great as it was a year ago. Everyone has slowed their spending.
That's right, but that doesn't mean they're reducing their spending, Ms Bullock.
No, it doesn't. No.
It
doesn't mean their spending is going down. It just means it's not growing as quickly as it was.
So I want to be clear about this. So have we got a situation now where younger folks who are more likely to be carrying debt are actually reducing their spending, where older folks who are more likely to have savings and lower or no levels of debt are still increasing their spending? So
there's a number of things going on here. I don't think you can equate younger folks with having debt.
Well, on average, a younger person is more likely to carry debt than an older person.
Well, so it depends again on what you think of younger folks. So there's people who might have families and mortgages. You might call them younger. But there's also a whole younger cohort who don't have mortgages, but they're renters. And so we've got a whole lot of things going on here. Number one being inflation, which everyone is seeing the cost of living rise dramatically. Everyone is being hit by that. Young folks, old folks, everyone. Then you've got renters who are being impacted by and they're typically younger and they're typically lower income. Those people, and not exclusively, of course, and those people will be are cutting back their expenditure, I think. And then you have perhaps younger to middle-aged people who have mortgages, and they will be affected by inflation and by interest rates, and they're cutting back their expenditure. And then you're right, there's another cohort which perhaps are getting more income on their savings. They have savings, a savings buffer that they accumulated during the pandemic when they couldn't travel, for example, and they are less constrained. They are still being hit by inflation, though. They are still observing the cost of living go up.
Are people over 65 increasing their spending at the moment?
I'd have to take the specifics on notice. My understanding is that in nominal terms they are. I'd have to check whether they're doing so in real terms.
Is there any way for monetary policy to slow down the spending of that cohort?
Monetary policy works through few channels, but the channel that most affects them is the one Chris referred to earlier, which is the incentive to save. So when interest rates go up, you are incentivised to save more than you would when interest rates are low. So that channel will impact people who don't have debts.
I guess the point actually, let me ask you this, Ms Bullock. Is it possible to use fiscal levers that I accept that are within the purview of government, not the RBA? Is it possible to use fiscal levers to slow the spending of that cohort? In general terms, I mean, you've accepted some in-principle comments already this morning. So I'm not asking you about specific policies or anything like that, but just in general terms, are there fiscal levers available?
In general terms, government policies can impact different cohorts. Monetary policy cannot.
Yep.
It has one lever, and it impacts people differently.
If folks, I mean, you've taken on notice the specifics of spending of people over 65, but are you concerned that that's one of the drivers of inflation, that is that folks over 65 are increasing their spending? I mean, doesn't that stimulate demand, which then flows through into inflation? I guess the proposition I'm putting to you is that you put up interest rates that disproportionately impacts on younger people as opposed to older people. So young people get used as cannon fodder in the war on inflation to try and solve a problem that they're actually not causing because they're cutting back their spending, whereas older people make bank and increase their spending because they have more money to do it, because higher inflation rates work for them. So how is that fair or just or equitable?
Senator, monetary policy has one lever, it's the interest rate, and we use it to try and impact aggregate demand, and we're having an impact on aggregate demand. The distributional impacts that you're referring to, we understand that, and as I've already talked with Senator O'Neill, I get letters, I understand that, I do. But I've only got one lever, and I have to get inflation down, because the best thing I can do for everyone, including all the young people who are being hurt by this, is to get inflation down.
So the Reserve Bank historically has consistently jawboned on things like wages, and your predecessor, Dr Lowe, repeatedly did that, warned against, wage growth and wage price spirals. Why doesn't the RBA jawbone more on fiscal policy?
Fiscal policy is not my mandate. Governments have a lot of balancing to do. They have a lot of infrastructure to build. They have things like aged care, health, the NDIS, the state governments have education. These are all things that society needs, and the governments need to provide these things. I am not going to tell governments who are elected by the people how to manage their fiscal policy. I ask them to think about inflation while they're thinking about that, and they do, but ultimately they've got to make decisions about what they think is best for their constituents.
Okay. Just on, I think it was Dr Kent's point around, and possibly you've referred to Ms Bullock, around, I think you called it incentive to save. Do you measure that? I mean, is that just like a principle, or do you actually measure? Is there any way to measure whether, say, for example, the over 65 cohort is actually banking, or do they choose to just increase their spending because they've got more money because interest rates are higher and their bank accounts are bigger?
I think there are a number of different sources of data and none of them are perfect. I think the thing that Michelle was referring to earlier about spending patterns, and I'll have to get back to you with the precise details, is when you look at the spending behaviour of different groups by age, they're remarkably similar in that everyone has slowed the growth of their spending. Now, there are some who are cutting back in the level of spending, some who are still increasing the growth in nominal terms, but it's much less growth than had been the case before we raised interest rates. So that's circumstantial evidence that says savings rates are staying at an elevated level, or actually not that high, but not dissimilar to where we were pre-pandemic. And they're doing that having built up a huge extra stock of savings during the pandemic. So they're not really tapping into that. So it's circumstantial, but the spending behaviour from the banks, sort of credit cards and how they're monitoring their accounts and how customers are using those, they provide us sort of high-level aggregates that say even for the older population, their spending growth has come right down. So it's consistent with that story.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Kent. Could I just ask you, you've said you take on notice a response to my question on spending patterns of over 65s. Could I just ask you to perhaps broaden that out and just, I'm not sure how you cut up the demographics in age terms, but perhaps you could give us what you have on the spending patterns of different age demographics.
We might have to provide you a broad story because often the banks provide that to us in confidence.
Okay, all right. Well, perhaps
we'll
you
see
can take
what
that
we
on.
can
If you
come
take that on notice and see what you can provide. Thanks. That'd be helpful. I just wanted to ask quickly about how you calculate rent inflation. Do you calculate rent inflation?
We make a forecast for rent inflation, and the way we sort of do it is we look at what's happening with advertised rents, which is a small chunk, obviously, of the stock, and we make some assumptions about how quickly that will feed through into rent in the CPI, which is based on the stock of rental accommodation. So that's sort of how we forecast.
Okay, so the ABS has started presenting rental inflation as a netted out figure, so they take the headline rate of rental inflation, and then they take into account Commonwealth rent assistance, and they provide it as a netted out figure. So the headline rate at the moment is 9.5. They take into account rent assistance, and they present that netted out figure at 7.8%. Does any of that feed into your calculations, and which figure do you take to represent rental inflation? The headline rate or the netted out figure?
In terms of our forecasting, we would follow what the methodology is that the ABS use, which is the concept of what rent are actually people facing, not what they would face in the absence of the Commonwealth rent assistance.
So
it's a little bit like the question before on other features coming from Senator Canavan, that we'll see different effects on headline and underlying.
So I guess I'm happy if you come back on notice on this, but isn't it the case that rent assistance doesn't actually bring rents down? It basically, because it's not it's a payment to renters, so it increases the bank balance of renters who are on government payments. So it's, I think, just under 50% of renters, but just in round terms, let's say 50%. So obviously, not everyone gets CRA, Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and it's a payment into the bank accounts of renters, so it doesn't actually reduce the price of rent. So why would when you run your calculations, why wouldn't you use the headline rate of rental inflation rather than an adjusted rate? I mean, I guess that's my question.
Chris's point, it depends on what you're forecasting. If you're forecasting headline inflation, then you take it into account. But if we want to look at underlying inflation, then we're looking at rental prices absent the Commonwealth rent assistance. It depends on what you're forecasting.
Okay. All right. So when you said at last estimates that you're expecting about a 10% increase in rents over the year, is that a gross increase or is that subtracting rent
I
assistance?
think that was gross.
That was
I think
gross.
that was
All right,
gross. But can I take that
Please.
on notice?
Thank you. And what's your current forecast for the pain that renters are going to feel over the next 12 months?
I think we'll have to take that one on notice too. We don't strip it out. I think from memory, I think we think that it's peaked and growth in rent is starting to come off. But I'll have to come back specifically on what our rental forecast is.
But nevertheless, significantly above inflation.
Yes, it's
The
significantly
general
above,
inflation.
significantly higher than other things in the basket.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Senator McKim. So, as people know, we've got the Governor and Dr Kent until 11. So we'll go to some very short blocks of questions now of 3 or 4 minutes each. Deputy Chair.
Thanks. So I think we've spoken this morning about monetary policy, fiscal policy. I think over the last year or so, you've been running a contractionary monetary policy cycle. Would that be right?
Mm-hmm. We think financial conditions are restrictive.
Yeah, that's right. So what about the fiscal position? Would you describe that as contractionary as well, or would you describe it as expansionary or neutral? How would you describe it?
I think, as I said earlier to an answer to a question, I think it's difficult to consider it in isolation. It's true that the budget has more expenditure in it. Mm-hmm. My main concern is what it's doing to inflation and what it's doing to aggregate demand. And I don't know the answer to that question until we've done our next forecasting round. And we've got the rest of the state budgets in as well because it's a whole of government thing. So the other thing it depends on very much is where the economy is at the moment. And at 11:30 we're going to find out where it was in March. And so it depends on the balance between the two things. There's more spending that might be expansionary, but it might be that it's offsetting an extremely weak private sector, in which case aggregate demand as a whole is not adding to inflationary pressures. So that's the sort of context I think we need to consider it in.
Well, I note your concern about the impact of fiscal policy, and I guess my only other question is then what about this discussion about the nature of there being homegrown inflation here in Australia, and to what extent do you think the fiscal position and fiscal policy is providing some of that homegrown inflation?
The homegrown inflation, which reflects what's been going on in the past, I think fiscal policy has been running a surplus the last couple of years, so I'd say that's been helping the homegrown inflation situation, if anything, in that circumstance. But more generally, as I said earlier, governments have a big balancing act. They have lots of competing priorities. I have one, inflation. They have lots of competing priorities, and they've got to deliver those in a way that manages not only aggregate demand, but also their commitments to provide infrastructure and services to the Australian people.
Thank you.
Senator Smith.
Just very briefly, and we have sort of skirted around the issue, but in the Financial Stability Assessment Report that was released in March 2024, there's an important table, graph 2.3, which looks at the liquid savings relative to housing and essential purposes. Graph 2.3, which refers to liquid savings relative to housing and essential expenses.
Yep.
And when talking about the response of the economy to rising interest rates, it talks about the strong financial position that people had previous to the cumulative effect of rising interest rates. But if I'm correct, the data is only as relevant. The data used is 2022. And I was wondering if you could provide a commentary on what this graph now looks like, because it specifically deals with the mortgagor and the rental, so those people that own their homes are excluded. But if you could give us a sense of what this graph now looks like, because in much of the commentary it's the strength of this position which has provided an important buffer to Australian families and households.
So the point, a couple of points. 22 is relevant because it's saying, as we were coming out of the pandemic, that the strength of the balance sheets had risen.
Yeah.
The data are the Hilda data. Hilda only comes out with substantial lag. I don't think there are data for 2023 for Hilda yet, but I'll have to take that question on notice, but I don't think so. But that's where we get those data from. So I'm not sure I can provide you with an update of that graph, but I'll come back to you.
But with all of your experience and all of your understanding and Dr Kent's exchange with Senator McKim, these graphs would be lower now than they were in 2022?
Well, I think that's the challenging thing, because it's not immediately clear. Because, as I suggested, the household sector as a whole has not burnt through that extra pile of savings which is incorporated in those figures coming out of the pandemic. Our experience is similar to lots of other economies. Where it's very different is to the US economy. The US consumer has burnt through that extra pandemic savings they've built up, but that's not the case in, say, Canada, in many other economies.
They've kept it. So the answer is we don't actually know, and it's possible it hasn't.
Great. If there is any other commentary you can provide on that particular graph, if you could take that on notice, I'd be most appreciative. Thank you.
Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to divert a little bit now and ask some questions about Armaguard. I understand since the last round of estimates that there have been media reports that there was a roundtable process that the RBA led to find a solution to the claims that Armaguard, who obviously is the sole provider of cash in transit now, that Armaguard would become insolvent. So is it correct that those roundtables have now ceased?
So the roundtables commenced, I think, at the end of last year. It was facilitated by me. It had the major banks initially the major banks around the table, and then more recently the major retailers and Australia Post have also joined the roundtables. They're facilitated by the bank. It's really to get everyone together to discuss the issues. We haven't had one since March. Whether or not we need to have another one will depend on how things are going, but we haven't sort of said that's the last one or anything like that. Right. It's just that we have them as we feel we need to. There are other groups, other than that broad round table that I chair, there are other groups also looking at longer-term solutions to the issue of cash distribution in a world of declining cash transactions. So that's chaired by someone else in the Reserve Bank, not me, and includes banks and retailers and Armaguard as well. So there's other meetings going on, just not that roundtable.
Right. So clearly the RBA then is still concerned that there is no long-term solution to the provision of a cash in transit service.
We are concerned that as transactional use of cash declines, the business model for distributing banknotes around the place is under pressure. We are concerned about that, and that's what Armaguard have really brought to the fore, and that's what the banks and the retailers and ourselves, we have an interest as well in trying to find what might be a solution to this. Other countries are experiencing similar situations. We're trying to learn from what they are doing overseas to address these issues. Our geography poses some challenges.
So in your dealings between the impacted customers, the banks and Armaguard, it's been reported that there was an offer made to Armaguard of $26 million to provide some stability to the company. Is that correct?
I have some knowledge of... we're not involved in those discussions, so I can't say for certain. I have heard that that's the case, and I think I've read it in the press. But we are not involved in those discussions. That's a matter between the banks and Armaguard.
Because, of course, the problem is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the provision of funds, particularly of this sort of magnitude, wouldn't simply solve the problem, would it? It's still going to be an ongoing problem. So what ongoing work was proposed to be conducted?
So no, and the concept always was that the banks and the retailers would provide some assistance to Armaguard to make sure the business kept running while other solutions were looked at. And there's a number of things. There's the Armaguard-Prosegur merger, so Armaguard have to look quite closely at their operations to see if they can get efficiencies to improve their business model and the economics of the business model. There's issues to look at, like what are the incentives to move the banknotes around? Can we recycle them in a more efficient manner rather than sticking them in big trucks and moving them around? So, as I said, there is a group that I referred to earlier, which the Reserve Bank is involved in as well, which is looking at what are some of the practical ways forward that we could improve the reliability and the economics of this, and if we can't, how do we ensure that we continue to have a cash distribution system, and who pays for it?
So that's the different group that you're not personally leading?
That's the different group. I'm not personally running that, but there is a group, and the idea is that the amount of money that the banks are going to contribute and retailers are going to contribute is to keep the system running while the industry figures out how they transition to a new model.
Right. So is it the same group that's in the round? I have a few more on this issue, but I will come back. But
the same group of banks and retailers under a authorisation by the ACCC to allow them to talk to one another about these issues. The Reserve Bank chairing it as an independent facilitator, if you like, trusted.
Okay, just on that 26 million, what is your understanding of how it was structured? Was it a loan? Did it come with interest?
I have no information
and you
on
don't
exactly
know who it came from?
I don't know. I have little bits of information, but I wouldn't like to, A, tell you something that was wrong, or B, give you information that, in fact, I'm not permitted to give you because it was given to me confidentially, so to the bank confidentially. So I'd have to come back on notice with that, and to the extent that it's been provided to us in confidence, I'm not sure I can provide.
If you would come back to the committee on that on notice, I think that would be very helpful. Was there a payment of $26 million offered? What did it come with any interest? Was it a loan? Is this something that the bank, offering free money, has done in the past?
Can I just be clear here? The Reserve Bank has not contributed.
Sorry, I should have said the banks.
Yep. Okay.
Have done in the past, offer free money. And what was the aim of due diligence work that would have been conducted as part of that payment?
So again, this is not an agreement that the Reserve Bank is party to. To the extent that we have any information that's been provided to us, I suspect it's in confidence. But and I am aware of the discussions that are going on, but I just want to be very clear. I can take it on notice, but it's quite possible that whatever information I have, I cannot provide.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Canavan.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll quickly go back to what I was asking about before, just briefly. We went over before that I think you said it's likely the government's energy rebates will fall out of the trim mean forecast, given the size of the change will occur there. Does that mean then that the RBA's trimmed mean forecast for next financial year at 3.1%, that's unchanged at the moment from the budget?
Well, we haven't done another forecasting.
Right,
so we can't say yet what our implications are.
When will that be? That will be the next statement?
August. We'll release the next forecasts in August.
All right. Now, just I actually want to switch to headline inflation then. So not the underlying forecast, but the headline forecasts. I think you said earlier, but just to compare, that the bank's assessment is that the Treasury's assessment that the measures in the budget, the relief measures, would reduce headline inflation by around half a percentage point in 24-25. Was that?
Yeah,
right?
I think that also includes some of the rebates in some of the states as well. That's
right.
The Treasury forecast.
Okay.
but we concur that that's the ballpark probably.
Yep. Okay. I suppose you should add there, I believe, obviously the Commonwealth says, and I believe the state ones that I've seen are all sort of one-off measures for the next financial year that will, as you said, lower the index value effectively for the CPI this financial year. Doesn't that mean that inflation would be higher now in 25-26?
Well, it means that as the rebate drops out, and this is why we look through it, then the price goes back up to where it was. Now,
which means growth would be the growth rate.
Growth rate will pop up, but what we don't know is what's happening to everything else in the inflation basket. So if everything else, it doesn't necessarily mean it goes up higher than it was or back to where it was. Depends on what else is happening.
Obviously, I'm asking a question about everything else being equal. So everything else being equal,
it drops out and the level goes back up.
This will cause it to go down, but then kick up.
That's correct.
Because it's now off a lower base, growing off a lower base. Okay. Thank you. I still have time.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'll come back because I'm going into a different topic. So if it's one question,
Senator,
won't be enough.
thank you. Thanks, Senator Canavan. Senator Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing. We missed you last time because I couldn't get in the schedule. So I just want to get a quick update on many things, as many as possible. Part of the Reserve Bank's process is to review inflation data and unemployment data. Do you use data from the ABS? And if so, do you use that data exclusively, or do you have other sources for unemployment and inflation data?
So we use ABS data, obviously, for inflation and unemployment. We use a variety of other sources of information, though, because we don't just focus on the unemployment rate itself. We focus on a variety of measures that the ABS put out. We also focus on things like vacancies, advertisements. There's information we get from our business liaison program where we talk to businesses about what they're doing with their labour forces. Are they demanding more labour or not? So we use the ABS data, but we have a wealth of other information that we look at as well.
Thank you. Business-to-business payment defaults and business bankruptcies to the third quarter of 2024 are at a record. I'm sure you know that. Are you watching these metrics, and would these record figures act to reduce the appetite in the Reserve Bank for another interest rate rise?
So we do watch the business insolvencies data. My understanding is that they haven't actually returned to the trend that they were prior to the pandemic. So in the pandemic, with low interest rates and government assistance, insolvencies were actually at a record low. They have popped up, but they haven't popped up to where the trend was going prior to the pandemic. So I think that's important perspective to put it in. We do look at it, and we look at it from a couple of perspectives. We look at it from the perspective of how monetary policy is impacting businesses, but we also look at it from the perspective of financial stability and the potential impact on banks and banks' arrears and the impact on banks' balance sheets.
Thank you. Suicide Prevention Australia Community Tracker, also to third quarter 2024, shows a huge rise in calls to help services, suicidal behaviour and clinical presentations. This is an independent and accurate barometer of how everyday Australians are doing. Are you aware of that tracker?
Yes, I am, and in fact I have regular meetings with various organisations, for example Beyond Blue. They talk to us a lot about these sort of data. We also talk to ACOS regularly. We talk to other charities in our business liaison program, and we hear a lot about the fact that charities are seeing people come in who they haven't seen before. So this is obviously an indication that they're stressed. So yes, we do keep in touch with that stuff.
Thank you. Can you update me on the state of the central bank digital currency, please? Last word we had, I think, was when Mr DeBell was Deputy Governor. I understand you're developing a standard, not an actual currency itself. Is that correct?
We're not. So we've done a couple of things. We ran a pilot program with a real claim on the central bank last year.
Is that what's known as a sandbox?
It was sort of like a sandbox, if you like, and we had a number of different use cases. Various businesses came in with their use cases to use the central bank digital currency. From that information, what we took away was that probably the most fruitful piece of research we could continue with was the use of a central bank digital currency in a wholesale sense, in which I mean there's a lot of discussion about putting assets on the ledger, so having a distributed ledger of financial assets, for example, and then could you have a central bank digital currency which was used to make settlements of those financial instruments, or they might be physical instruments, they might be physical assets. So that's the most fruitful work, and that's where we're going at the moment. We're trying to stand up a project, we're in the process of standing up a project which looks at how could a central bank currency be used in atomic settlement of assets. That's where we're going at the moment.
Developing a standard?
No, it's basically we're looking at the business, what the business case might look for it. We're not so interested in the technology. We're not so interested in standards. What we're interested in is there a business case for this?
So would a standard? So would that allow other parties then, including each of the banks, to develop their own cryptocurrency?
So the banks themselves can develop what some people call stable coins, and some banks have developed stable coins. Central bank digital currency, if it's developed, would be something that everyone could potentially use. Not literally every Australian, because if we're focusing on business, then it might be that some businesses can use it, but it's not central. Individual banks can, in theory at the moment, and some of them have experimented with stable coins, which are effectively cryptocurrencies.
Last question, Senator Roberts.
So, excuse me, this would not exclude existing cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin?
No, the central bank digital currencies would not have a relationship with Bitcoin, no.
But it wouldn't exclude Bitcoin?
What do you mean by exclude Bitcoin?
Sideline them, remove them.
No, Bitcoin would continue to exist, but central bank digital currencies offer a different business proposition than Bitcoin. Bitcoin has particular uses. Central bank digital currencies would not be encroaching on that space, I suspect.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Senator Rennick.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, guys. How are you going? Look, I just want to table those serial numbers as well, if that's all right. But could I get on notice, because I'm pretty sure you won't know off the top of your head, how much the RBA and the Government of Australia pays the Bank of England to store the gold in England? And the reason why I ask that is, as you know, we've just been on a Public Works Committee where we've been down to the basement of the RBA building, and there's obviously vaults and things down there. Would it be possible, if we brought our gold back to Australia and stored the gold in the vaults at the bottom of the RBA building, that would be a way to pay for the cost of the asbestos? So that's going to cost about $1 billion. Wouldn't it be a way to help pay for that, refurbishing the RBA building?
Well, we can take that on notice.
I guess what you'd be doing, though, is spending a lot of money securely bringing all that gold back. So that's 80 tonnes of gold under security plus all the freight. And the other thing you'd be... Well, potentially, yeah. Yeah, it would take some time, and you'd have to find someone to buy it from. The other thing you'd be doing is you'd be giving up the option to lend out that gold.
But that's all, as you've said in the past, though, that gold doesn't move. It's just
it's lent out to people who pay us interest for those loans. While
that's right, but you can still do that if the gold's here. That's all electronic.
No, they don't want it here in Sydney. They want it in London.
Yeah, that's what worries me. And as you'll see when I've tabled these figures, is that the serial numbers have all been refined from 2015 or 14 onwards. So, and that's part of the reason. But anyway, I don't want to dwell on that because I've got a short period of time. Now, in regards to the cash issue, RH just handed down a report about the closure of branches in the regions, and one of the recommendations has been with the RBA to use the RBA's payment system, transfer and payment system, combined with Australia Post, to actually keep a government-provided bank branches open in the regions or metropolitan areas, and that is another way to generate income to help pay for the $1 billion in asbestos. Is that something, do you think the RBA could work with the government and Australia Post to provide banking facilities along with cash?
That's really a matter for the government. If the government wants to set up individual government banks in the regions, that's a matter for the government. The Reserve Bank does not distribute cash itself. The Reserve Bank obviously distributes cash to the banks themselves, and they they distribute it around.
But as you know, though, sorry to cut you off there, but as you know, the banks don't want to know about it. It's all too expensive, and they've walked away and they're saying they're private industry and it's not our problem. So ultimately, the RBA, I know you're independent, but ultimately you're a government body. You know, at the end of the day, I just think that's something that
again, it's a matter for the government.
Okay, cool. I'll leave it at that.
It's a matter for the government if they want to set up banks and cross-subsidise to bring money into them.
Okay, thank you. And then last question. Are you aware of the 1937 banking Royal Commission into banking that basically said the central bank should be responsible for the control of volume of credit in the system? Are you familiar? Are you familiar with that recommendation?
I'm familiar with the Royal Commission. I haven't read it recently, I will confess, and not specifically that particular recommendation.
Okay, and the second part is that the distribution of credit should be the responsibility of private banks. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that the RBA take over all private banking facilities, but in regards to control of the volume of credit in the system, I want to now refer to 1985, where Paul Keating's lifted all capital controls and basically allowed foreign banks to come in and lend to our private banks. And household debt has gone from 40% of GDP to 120% of GDP. Do you think it was reckless of the government at the time to completely lift capital controls and have no control over the type of capital that comes into the country and how it's used?
No, I think that Australia has done very well in the recent years since we floated the exchange rate and eliminated capital controls. It's allowed foreign investment to flow, and I think that generally most people think that the deregulatory period, including the deregulation of the banks, allowed people to access credit who were previously credit constrained. So I think generally people would say deregulation has been a good thing.
Even though we've got 120% household debt and people are now struggling and rented homeless?
We can get into debates about that, and there's a couple of, at least one good RDP it explains that particular issue. But back in the heavily regulated days, people were credit constrained. So the minute you allow people to borrow, good credit risks who couldn't get credit before, then of course the debt to income ratio is going to rise. It also rises because as inflation has come down and interest rates have come down, the debt service ratio has come down. So that allows people to take on a bit more debt.
That's right, but now interest rates are rising.
And then finally, the final point I would make is that Australia, unlike many other countries, the rental housing stock is owned by households. So overseas it's owned by corporations, it's owned by governments. So the household debt is partly a result of the fact that the higher household debt is partly a result of the fact that we have the housing rental stock owned by households. So that's the other part. So there's a number of factors
I accept that
indicate why it's
okay, thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
I do have another appointment that I have to make.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Senator Rennick. The committee will consider the document that you've provided at a later meeting and consider it as to whether it should be tabled. Thank you very much, Governor Bullock.
I promise I won't ask another question. We do have some more questions for you. One of those might be a request for a private briefing on this Armaguard issue if you cannot speak to us at the committee.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Bullock and Dr Kent for answering our questions as always, and you go with our thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.